Look at them, the towering temples of Tikal, the celestial observatory of Chichen Itza, a civilization that mastered astronomy, mathematics, and architecture while Europe was still in the Dark Ages. They calculated the movements of the cosmos with breathtaking accuracy. They conceived the concept of zero long before anyone else. They were the Maya, brilliant, powerful, and seemingly eternal. Now, look closer. Silence. An impenetrable jungle has consumed their great pyramids. The plazas where millions once gathered are empty. The sophisticated urban centers that once housed kings, priests, and astronomers are mere stone ghosts. The question is, perhaps the greatest archaeological riddle of the last 500 years. How did the Maya, the greatest civilization in the ancient Americas, simply disappear? Not vanish, but collapse. In a single 200-year window between 800 and 1000 AD, their monumental building project stopped. Their writing system ceased. Their god-kings abandoned their thrones. 90% of the population fled the great lowland cities. It was a cataclysmic, wholesale failure of a magnificent system. For decades, the standard answer has been simple: drought, a devastating climate-driven crisis. But what if that is merely the simplest chapter of a far more complex and frankly terrifying book? What if the Maya did not fall victim to a sudden act of God, but to a slow, systemic suicide, a perfect storm of their own making? In this deep dive, we journey beyond the simple climate theory. We will uncover three converging layers of evidence, from the deepest lakebed sediments to the scarred faces of ancient monuments, that reveal the true, multifaceted story of their collapse. A story of environmental self-destruction, chronic warfare, and the fatal arrogance of a ruling elite. If the great historical mysteries of vanished empires and the lessons they hold for our modern world captivate you, then please take a moment to subscribe to the channel now. We are committed to bringing you the most thoroughly researched and visually compelling documentaries on history's greatest riddles. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our journey into the past. Now, let us return to the great jungles of the Yucatan and the rise of the kings. To understand the collapse, we must first appreciate the height from which they fell. The classic period of the Maya, spanning from approximately 250 AD to 900 AD, was an era of unprecedented intellectual and cultural achievement. Forget the image of primitive tribes. The Maya built sprawling, dynamic metropolitan areas. Tikal, in modern-day Guatemala, was a gleaming capital city that may have held up to 100,000 residents, rivaling the size of London in the 17th century. These cities were connected by a network of causeways and surrounded by intensively managed farmlands. They were not a unified empire like Rome, but a collection of fiercely independent and competing city-states bound together by a shared culture, religion, and the constant threat of war. Their advancements were nothing short of miraculous. Their calendar system, particularly the long count, tracked time with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. They conceived the number zero, not just as a placeholder, but as a mathematical concept, a feat of abstract reasoning that changed calculation forever. The Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque stands as a testament to their engineering and their obsession with documenting history through their unique, complex hieroglyphic script. The foundation of this brilliance, however, lay in a fragile balance: the king. The Maya ruler was not just a political figure, he was a divine intermediary, the Kuhul Ajahu, the Holy Lord. His primary role was to communicate with the gods, ensuring the celestial order was maintained, and most critically, to guarantee the rains came for the vital maize crop. Their entire political and religious architecture was built on this sacred responsibility. If the king failed, the heavens had abandoned the people. And this is where the fatal flaw began to emerge. The system was too rigid, too dependent on the infallible power of the ruler and the endless bounty of nature. The competitive nature of the city-states, once a driver of innovation, became a source of terminal weakness. The most persistent and foundational theory for the Maya collapse is the climate crisis, specifically the mega-droughts, and the evidence is undeniable. Modern paleoclimatology has provided us with a historical record of the weather, literally pulled from the earth. By examining sediment cores drilled deep into the beds of lakes like Lake Chichancanab and the Cariaco Basin, scientists can analyze the isotopes of oxygen and gypsum layers. The findings are stark. The period between 800 and 1000 AD was marked by the most intense and prolonged periods of dryness in the last 7,000 years. Water levels plummeted, with rainfall decreasing by as much as 70% during the peak of the dry season. This was a catastrophic blow to a society utterly dependent on seasonal rain for its subsistence farming. This theory perfectly explains the mass exodus. No rain, no corn. No corn, no food. No food, no populace to support the kings and priests. The people had to move to survive. But the drought theory alone is incomplete. If it were merely a drought, why did some cities survive and even flourish in the northern Yucatan? Cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan, built atop vast natural sinkholes called cenotes, natural freshwater wells, weathered the initial environmental storm. They adapted. They rose in prominence, while the southern behemoths like Tikal were sinking into silence. This tells us the crisis was not just about lack of water. It was about the system's inability to adapt to the lack of water. The southern cities were built on a precarious infrastructure of reservoirs and rainfall. When the rains failed, the entire social contract failed. The king had promised rain, and the king had failed. The crisis was existential, not just environmental. It cracked the belief system upon which the entire civilization rested. As the rains failed and the faith wavered, the Maya turned upon themselves. The second, and perhaps most brutally destructive layer of the collapse was chronic warfare. Initially, Maya warfare was ritualistic, a stylized form of combat aimed at capturing high-ranking enemy lords for ceremonial sacrifice. It was a demonstration of divine power. But as resources dwindled, the nature of war changed. It became total, desperate, and existential. Archaeological evidence in the form of defensive ramparts, palisades, and fortified city borders shows a drastic increase in preparation for conflict. Analysis of skeletal remains from the late Classic period reveals a horrifying spike in trauma, crushing blows, decapitations, and mass burial sites indicative of bloody massacres and scorched earth tactics. City-states that once shared cultural heritage began to wage campaigns of utter destruction. It became a savage fight for the last remaining patches of arable land and water. The city of Dos Pilas is a tragic example. Once a powerful capital, its rulers eventually constructed a desperate, low-slung defensive wall through the center of their own city, hastily recycling stone from older buildings. They were surrounded, starved, and eventually annihilated. The message was clear. In the final centuries, the Maya were not killed by strangers, but by their neighbors, their rivals, and their own kin. And they were unknowingly destroying their future by killing their own land. The second silent killer was environmental suicide through mass deforestation. Imagine the colossal scale of the construction. Every monumental temple, every smooth plaza, every elaborate stucco facade required immense quantities of limestone plaster or stucco. To make this stucco, the Maya had to burn limestone at extremely high temperatures. The fuel? Wood. Estimates suggest that for every 10 square meters of a temple's surface requiring this brilliant white plaster, an entire hectare of forest had to be cleared. Multiply that by the hundreds of structures in cities like Tikal, and the environmental impact is staggering. They were deforesting their own landscape at an alarming rate. Deforestation creates a catastrophic feedback loop. Less forest cover means less evapotranspiration, less moisture being released back into the atmosphere to form clouds. When the natural drought cycles hit, the human-caused deforestation intensified the drought, making the already limited rainfall even scarcer. The Maya were quite literally heating their own homes and drying out their own fields, inadvertently deepening the very crisis the kings were praying to the gods to avert. They were the architects of their own ecological undoing. The final and most crucial layer of the collapse lies in the failure of the elite class, the political suicide of the ruling system. This is where the historical data intersects with the chilling, cautionary tale. Let us briefly personify this crisis through a fictionalized but historically grounded character, Kinich Yaxcook, the last Kuhul Ajao of the city of Piedras Negras. Kinich was a man raised in opulence, his life defined by ritual and divine expectation. His every act, from bloodletting ceremonies to temple dedications, was designed to reinforce his status as the voice of the gods. Yet, as the rains failed year after year, the populace looked up at his soaring temples and saw not a god, but a liar. The scriptural silence, one of the most telling signs of the collapse, is found in the epigraphic record. In city after city, the carving of the stelae, the magnificent stone monuments that celebrated the king's birth, victories, and alliances, simply stops. The last dated monument at Tikal is 869 AD. At the once mighty city of Copan, it is 822 AD. The elite suddenly lost the will, or perhaps the power, to write their own history. The narrative of the king's infallibility had run out of time. The populist revolt. Evidence suggests that the populace, starving and abandoned by their divine protectors, rose up. At sites like Dos Pilas and Ceibal, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberate vandalism, targeting the faces and images of the ruling kings on the stelae. It wasn't just random damage, it was a focused, symbolic rejection of the divine authority that had failed them. They were tearing down the monuments of the leaders who had driven them into the environmental and military abyss. And how did the rulers, like our hypothetical Kinich Yakskuk, respond? With more arrogance. In the face of drought, they should have shared resources, coordinated between city-states, and diversified crops. Instead, their fragile egos and competitive political structure led them to do the exact opposite. They doubled down on the one thing they knew: monumentalism. If the gods were angry, they reasoned, they must build a bigger temple. If a rival city was suffering, they must attack and steal their remaining resources. It was a race to the bottom, where every competitive act, every new resource-intensive construction, every needless war hastened the total, collective ruin of the region. The political system, designed for growth and prosperity, became a lethal engine of decline when faced with scarcity. The system committed suicide. The final truth, the most critical part of the story, is often misunderstood. The Maya did not disappear, only their system disappeared. When the great cities failed, the kings fled or were killed, the priesthood dissolved. The sophisticated structure of the classic period simply ceased to function, but the people, the millions of farmers, artisans, and laborers did not vanish. They migrated. They walked away from the ruined metropolises and scattered to the north, toward the coast, and into smaller, less politically centralized settlements. They reverted to simpler, more sustainable forms of agriculture. They survived. The great unified cultural narrative was broken, but the people endured. In fact, the descendants of the ancient Maya still inhabit the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, a vibrant population of over 7 million people who continue to speak dozens of Mayan languages. Their oral traditions, their understanding of the stars, and their connection to the land are a living testament to the resilience of a culture that watched its own Gilded Age collapse. The warning. The story of the Maya is a profound cautionary tale for the 21st century. Their collapse was not caused by a single factor, but by the devastating convergence of 4 forces. 1. Climate change, a natural environmental stressor, drought. 2. Environmental destruction, human action, deforestation that amplified the natural stressor. 3. Chronic conflict, increased competition for shrinking resources. 4. Political fragility, a rigid, competitive, and arrogant ruling class that refused to adapt, ultimately leading to their own systemic failure. The Maya show us that even the most brilliant civilizations are not immune to collapse when social order, environmental stewardship, and political will fracture under pressure. We stand today on a planet facing similar environmental challenges. The question is whether our global, interconnected system is as rigid and ultimately self-destructive as the ancient city-states of the Maya lowlands. Their silence whispers a warning across the centuries. The pyramids of Tikal still stand, but they are tombs to a way of life that failed. They remind us that the greatest threat to a civilization often comes not from outside invaders, but from within. What are your thoughts? Do you believe the drought was the primary killer, or was the ultimate responsibility the Maya's own political arrogance? Leave a comment below and tell us what you think the greatest lesson from the Maya collapse is for modern society. We read every comment, and your insights help drive the direction of our next investigative documentary. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden truths of history.